Aggregate demand curve is a line showing a negative relationship between inflation and the aggregate quantity of goods and services demanded at that inflation rate. This figure shows an aggregate demand curve. Note that the inflation is plotted on the y-axis, the vertical axis, while the real GDP is measured by the x-axis, the horizontal axis. Why does the aggregate demand curve slope downward? To explain, we answer this question and derive the curve in 3 stages. Stage 1. We explain the negative relationship between the real interest rate and real GDP. Stage 2. We explain the positive relationship between inflation and interest rates. And stage 3, we show how the two relationships combine to get the AD curve. Consumption, investment, and net exports are negatively related to investment. Investment is negatively related to the real interest rates because the real interest rates is the cost of borrowing, and higher interest rates make borrowing more costly. This relationship is true, regardless of whether the investment is for capital equipment or for residential investment. Net exports are negatively related to investment because higher real interest rates will cause the country's currency to appreciate and the net exports to decrease. Lower real interest rates will cause the country's currency to depreciate and increase net exports. Consumption is negatively related to interest rates because higher real interest will encourage people to save more and consume less. Lower interest rates will encourage people to save. Economists believe that the effect of the real interest rate on consumption is smaller than its effects on investment and net exports. Since investment, net exports, and consumption are all negatively related to the interest rate, then the aggregate spending should be negatively related to the real interest rate. This figure illustrates the effect of a lower interest rate on the spending balance and GDP. In this figure, a higher interest rate will result in a lower expenditure line because consumption, investment, and net exports will decrease. The intersection of the new expenditure line with the 45-degree line denotes the new spending balance. The new spending balance is at a lower level of real GDP. If real interest rates decrease, then investment, net exports, and consumption will increase, resulting in a higher spending balance and a higher level of real GDP. The monetary policy rule is a description of how much the interest rate or other instruments of monetary policy respond to inflation or other measures of the state of the economy. This figure illustrates a hypothetical interest rate response of the central bank to changes in the inflation rate. In the table, the central bank responds to higher inflation by raising the interest rates. For example, if the inflation rates increase from 5% to 6%, the central bank will respond by increasing the nominal interest rate from 8.5% to 10%. Note also that the increase in the interest rate is higher than the increase in the inflation rate. This is because the real interest rate, which is the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate, must rise in order for aggregate demand to fall. This figure illustrates the same hypothetical monetary policy rule in the previous table. Note that since the nominal interest rates must rise faster than the inflation rates, the line depicting the real interest rates is an upward sloping line. This figure illustrates the monetary policy rule using real interest rates, as opposed to nominal interest rates. When inflation rates rise, the Federal Reserve responds by raising the real interest rates through a more than proportional increase in the nominal interest rate. The federal funds rate is the interest rate on overnight loans between banks that the Federal Reserve influences by changing the supply of funds, or bank reserves, in the market. If the Fed wants to increase the federal funds rate, it must decrease the supply of reserves by selling bonds. If the Fed wants to decrease the federal funds rate, it must increase the supply of reserves by buying bonds. The target inflation rate is the central bank's goal for the average rate of inflation over the long run. Some central banks, like the Bank of England and the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, have explicit inflation targets, while the Federal Reserve's inflation target is not explicitly announced. The aggregate demand curve has a negative slope. An example, a higher inflation means lower real GDP. A change in the real GDP due to a change in inflation is a movement along the aggregate demand curve. This figure illustrates how the aggregate demand curve is derived. In this figure, an increase in inflation will cause the Fed to react by raising the real interest rate. A higher real interest rate will decrease aggregate expenditures, shifting the aggregate expenditure line downwards, resulting in a decline in the real GDP. With real GDP on the x-axis and inflation rate on the y-axis, the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, since the higher inflation rate resulted in a lower real GDP level. The aggregate demand curve can be caused by changes in the 1. Government purchases, 2. Inflation target rate, and 3. Other changes, net exports, consumer confidence, taxes. Higher government purchases will result in a higher level of GDP at every inflation rate. This is graphically represented by a shift in the 80 curve to the right and is illustrated in the next figure. Lower government purchases will result in a lower GDP level at every inflation rate. This is graphically represented by a shift in the 80 curve to the left. A higher inflation target requires a higher level of spending and a lower interest rate. This will shift the 80 curve to the right, which is illustrated here. On the other hand, a lower inflation target requires a lower level of spending and a higher interest rate. This will shift the 80 curve to the left. This figure summarizes the effects of a change in other variables on the AD curve. Lower taxes, higher consumption, and higher demand for the country's exports will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Higher taxes, lower consumption, and a lower demand for the country's exports will shift the AD curve to the left. In 2001, President George W. Bush signed the law, a first major piece of legislation of his presidency that would include a $1.35 trillion tax cut over 10 years. Highlights of his tax cuts included up to a $300 rebate for single taxpayers, up to $600 rebates for joint filers, a $500 child tax credit, and a top rate cut from 39.6% to 35%. As the economy experienced a slowdown in 2001, the government reacted by decreasing the tax rates paid by consumers. The tax cut was expected to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. The inflation adjustment line is a flat line showing the level of inflation in the economy at a given point in time. It shifts up when the real GDP is greater than potential GDP, and it shifts down when the real GDP is lower than potential GDP. The line also shifts when expectations of inflation or raw material prices change. This figure illustrates how the IA line shifts. On the top graph, the inflation adjustment curve shifts upwards when the real GDP is above the potential GDP. On the bottom graph, the IA curve shifts downwards when the real GDP is below the potential GDP. If the real GDP equals the potential GDP, then the IA line will not shift. An increase in the expectations of inflation will shift the inflation adjustment line upwards, while a decrease in the expectations of inflation will shift the inflation adjustment line downwards. An increase in the prices of commodities will shift the IA line upwards, while a decrease in the price of commodities will shift the IA line downwards. This figure illustrates the determination of the level of real GDP and the inflation rate. The intersection of the IA line with the AD curve determines the equilibrium of real GDP and inflation in the economy. With a given AD curve, a low IA line will result in a higher equilibrium level of GDP relative to potential and a lower inflation rate. This is illustrated by the graph on the right. With the given AD curve, a high IA line will result in a lower equilibrium level of GDP relative to potential and a higher inflation rate. This is illustrated by the graph on the left. The middle graph in this figure illustrates the IA line intersecting the AD curve at a point where the economy is at the potential GDP.